If you made a list of the most iconic brands of the 90s, very few had a more legendary run than the Gap. From well-executed product to a generational run in the marketing department, Gap's rise through the 80s to its peak in the 90s can be described as nothing short of sensational. But once we crossed over into the 2000s, everything changed. Through overexpansion, internal clashes, and a series of simply horrible business decisions, Gap found itself as the laughingstock of mall brands. But are they poised for a comeback? Now, if we've never met before, my name's Nick and I like to talk about clothes. You can find me over on Instagram and TikTok as @NickThrowsAFit, where I have a bunch of short form videos that you might also like. Now, I'll preface this by saying this video is the first in a series where I'm diving into everything in the Gap Inc. umbrella, and this one is exclusively about the Gap brand. We'll chat about Banana Republic, Old Navy, and the rest of Gap Inc. later, so be sure to subscribe for when those come out. I like to think of this story in 4 parts. First, we have the inception and early days of the Gap with Don Fisher as CEO, the period where the brand got off the ground and started to find itself. Then we have the Mickey Drexler area, and this is the true rise of the brand. This is where the brand became fully vertical and built their brand identity, reaching its peak in the process. And then comes the identity crisis era, where the company completely lost sight of everything that made it special. And finally, we have the comeback era, where for the first time in a long time, Gap has some real potential at a comeback. So let's dive into part 1, and in order to do that, we need to go back to 1969. Gap was started in San Francisco by Don Fisher, a real estate developer who noticed that major retailers were always out of stock in common Levi's sizes. So to take the nightmare out of the buying experience, he and his wife Doris opened a store whose sole premise was to keep Levi's in stock all the time. And to attract the younger customers, they also sold vinyl records. And originally, if Don had it his way, the name of the company would have been Pants and Discs. But thankfully, Doris talked him out of that, and they settled on the generation gap, which was a zeitgeisty term at the time describing the difference between the older and younger generations. And the generation gap was an immediate hit. By 1973, they already had 23 stores, including a discount store called Pants Off, which obviously isn't around anymore, but I give them a 10 out of 10 for the name. And by 1976, the company already went public. Gap was especially popular with the younger crowd thanks to its well-merchandised stores and the iconic "Fall into the Gap" jingle. But through their early expansion, they ran into a big problem. See, they were selling a lot of clothes, but at that time they were much more of a retail logistics company than they were a fashion brand. And that was risky because around the same time, Levi's signed deals with retail giants JCPenney and Sears to also sell their jeans there, and that undercut Gap's role as a Levi's go-to. They needed their own label, and they needed it fast. So in the late 70s, Gap started experimenting with their own in-house label, starting with the Gap Fashion Pioneer line. And they made some solid pieces, but nothing really stood out and screamed Gap. People were still seeing them as the Levi's store. They desperately needed a strong brand identity, but under Don Fisher, they just couldn't get it right. So how would they solve this problem? Well, that question would begin to be answered in 1983 when they brought in Mickey Drexler as president of the company. Now today, Mickey is known as the godfather of retail. And when he came over to Gap, he had just overhauled Ann Taylor, giving it a chic new image and quadrupling its sales in the process. And before leaving, he also poached Maggie Gross, their head of marketing, who later on you'll see became a key part in Gap's rise to fame, but we'll touch more on her later. Mickey had one core belief, and that was product is king. From day one, he knew that Gap needed to cut the outside brand. His vision was for Gap to be fully vertical, controlling everything from design to retail, and to build a brand around what people were already coming to the Gap for, which was elevated basics like jeans, khakis, tees, and button-downs. So a year into his tenure as president, the first big move was releasing their pocket tee in 24 different colors. And this is most notable because a year later it was worn by Marty McFly in Back to the Future, giving it a huge push with the younger crowd. And there they continued to develop their product line, and Gap already started to get a cult following. So by the late 80s, with a logo refresh and a lineup of clean foundational basics, the brand's momentum was palpable. And the timing couldn't have been more perfect. The minimalism trend was already starting to heat up, and Gap was perfectly positioned to ride that wave. There was just one problem. They were still selling Levi's. So in 1991, they finally cut the cord with the denim brand, and from that point on, Gap was completely vertical, owning every step from sketch to shelf. And as a result, they did incredibly well. At this point, their basics were starting to work their way into wardrobes across America, with some of the best quality for money pieces you could get your hands on. But as great as the product was, it took a back seat to what was happening in the marketing department. If Gap's clothing was Scottie Pippen, the marketing was Michael Jordan. Under Maggie Gross, Gap launched some of the most fabled ad campaigns of all time. It started with The Individuals of Style, a black and white portrait series featuring icons like Lenny Kravitz, Spike Lee, Naomi Campbell, and Whoopi Goldberg. And then came my personal favorite, the Who Wore Khakis campaign, which showed culture's most iconic figures over the years wearing khakis. But the kicker was, none of them were wearing Gap's khakis. But the campaign was executed so well that it made Gap synonymous with khakis. These campaigns alone were masterfully done, combining minimalism, impeccable styling, and celebrity influence to show that Gap was for everyone. And just when you thought they were done, later in the decade, they launched the legendary khaki swing commercial, a high-energy swing dancing celebration of khakis that became one of the most recognizable commercials ever. Add in viral moments like Sharon Stone wearing a Gap tee to the Oscars, plus commercials featuring Aerosmith, Missy Elliott, and Madonna, and Gap was untouchable. By the year 2000, Gap had over 3,000 stores worldwide, and it was one of the most recognized and beloved brands on the planet. So their success continued from there. Gap became the #1 brand in history, and the story ends happily, right? Right? Absolutely not. This was the peak, and Gap would never again reach this level of cultural significance. So what happened? While some would argue that this was the financial peak, the true peak of the brand in terms of product and design came in the early to mid-90s. Once they started to hit critical mass in terms of popularity, things came more about chasing trends than they did about making quality products. Sure, their marketing was strong, but in hindsight, the looming death of their brand identity was glaringly obvious. In addition to this, the brand simply became bloated due to overexpansion. In 2000 alone, Gap opened 731 locations. And sure, sales hit $13.6 billion, but their profits tanked. And in 2001, they posted their first loss in company history, losing $7.7 million. As Ann Kingston of the National Post put it, simply put, the Gap has lost its groove. Its merchandising is unfocused, and it's lost ground to competitors. The formula that made it great no longer has the same currency. More damningly, Gap Inc. has alienated shoppers. So they were losing their older customers, and they failed to resonate with younger ones. Their competitors were cooler, faster, and cheaper, and Gap found itself in its own gap. So in 2002, Mickey Drexler, the man who was basically synonymous with Gap, stepped down as CEO. And he would go on to have another massive run reviving J. Crew, but the Gap wouldn't be so lucky. They handed the reins of CEO over to Paul Pressler, a former Disney executive. Pressler was the complete opposite of Mickey in so many ways, and that's exactly what the Gap thought they needed. Mickey led with a creative vision, but at this point, Gap already had creatives hired, and they wanted the CEO to stay out of it. They needed someone like Pressler who leaned heavily into customer research and strategic planning. But that horribly backfired. The brand just became too analytical. Every decision they made was based off of data, and the human touch quickly disappeared. For the next 2 decades, Gap went through a full-blown identity crisis. I mean, everything about the brand started to scream corporate influence. It lost its edge, the quality lessened, but the prices went up. Design weakened, and their marketing just became white noise. Gap was dead in the water, and at this point they reeked of desperation, with no example greater than their 2010 logo redesign. In an effort to modernize, Gap replaced their old iconic serif logo with a sterile sans serif version. And this was so bad that it ended up getting pulled 6 days after its release because of how much outrage it caused. Gap had become the laughingstock of all of retail. And for the next 10 years, there's really nothing to write home about. Gap was essentially just treading water. They were starting to close down locations, and the signs of struggle were really starting to show. But then came the year 2020, and with it, a chance to completely change everything. Now, COVID-19 was obviously doing a number on the entire retail industry, but Gap thought this was a perfect time for a Hail Mary. And they actually turned to a familiar playbook: minimalist design fueled by celebrity influence. And there was nobody in the world who was doing it better at the time than Kanye West. On paper, it was the perfect move. Kanye was already a fan of the brand, and he had a track record of launching brands into the stratosphere, most notably with the Yeezy Adidas collab. Sure, it was risky, but if it worked, it could change everything for a company that desperately needed it. So in 2020, Gap signed Kanye to a 10-year deal, and their first collab was a zipperless blue puffer jacket, which sold out instantly. Next, and most notably, was what Kanye called the perfect hoodie, a double-layered pullover. And this collab was an absolute home run. According to Gap, this hoodie was their highest-selling online item in a single day ever. But most importantly, 70% of the customers were new to the brand. This is exactly what they needed, and Gap was on the cusp of being cool again. I mean, if they could just ride this wave, they would be back to relevance within a year or two. And then Kanye decided to, well, be Kanye, and absolutely crashed out on Instagram, calling out Gap for having meetings without him and saying that working with them was a nightmare. So in 2022, just 2 years into their 10-year deal, Gap and Kanye parted ways, which was a bummer because Gap was this close. I mean, if Kanye would have held it together for even just 1 more year and a few more collabs, this video could have been completely different. But 2022 into 2023 proved to be be perhaps the worst slide in company history. Gap started closing stores at an alarming rate after the pandemic. And just a couple months before the partnership with Kanye ended, their CEO stepped down because she couldn't fix the slump in stock price. And then 5 days after the Kanye debacle, the company laid off 500 employees in their corporate office. But if that wasn't bad enough, they laid off another 1,800 employees in April of 2003. Gap had been chewed up, spit out, kicked down the street, lit on fire. I mean, the only way that it could get any worse than this is if they just got rid of the company as a whole. At this point, it was critical. They didn't need to just be saved, they needed to be completely revived by somebody who knew what they were doing. And just 2 months after that second round of layoffs, their prayer was answered. They brought in Richard Dixon as CEO of Gap Inc., who knew a thing or two about reviving faded icons, most notably with his wildly successful revival of Barbie at Mattel. But the real question is, could he do it with Gap? Now, I know it's early on in his tenure, but I think the short answer is yes. Not just because of Dixon, but also because they brought in Zach Posen as the creative director of all of Gap Inc. in 2024. Posen's first task was a rebrand of Banana Republic, and that's proven to be wildly successful. And now he's putting in serious work on Gap. I mean, finally, it seems like he's tapping into the magic that made Gap great to begin with. Now, I'll be the first to say that as much as I love the designs that they're doing, their quality is still nowhere near what it needs to be. But from a trend standpoint, the circumstances are pretty similar to what it was in the late 80s to early 90s. So many people are putting a focus on investing in quality basics for their wardrobe, which is why you see brands like Uniqlo and Buck Mason making money hand over fist. So if Gap can dial in their quality issue, I think they have a real chance to make another run. But no matter what happens, Gap's influence is undeniable. They made basics aspirational, they made mall brands cool, and for a while, they defined how the country dressed. They may have lost their edge, but at their peak, Gap wasn't just a brand, it was an icon. So what do you think? Can Gap make a comeback? Be sure to sound off in the comments and let me know. Thank you so much for tuning into my YouTube debut. I hope you have a great day, and we'll see you next time.